Tennis's GOAT debate has developed into one of the most contentious sporting questions of modern times, as fans and analysts weigh up which of the big three, Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal and Novak Djokovic, is the game's greatest ever player. Sadly, the debate itself has never risen beyond knee-jerk assumptions favouring the present over the past. Every time Djokovic wins yet another Grand Slam singles title, commentators and past players rush to anoint him as the game's GOAT. Yet every time Nadal takes out another French Open, these same experts prove all too ready to make precisely the same claim about him, as indeed they did about Federer back in his stellar 2017 season when he wound back the clock and reclaimed the world #1 ranking in his mid-30s. All three of these legendary champions, in short, have taken turns being the tennis world's flavour of the month, culminating in the incredibly superficial claim that whoever wins the most Grand Slam singles titles out of the trio must be the greatest player ever. The claim itself makes for an attractive proposition. After all, tennis at its heart is a zero-sum game, all about wins and losses. Crowd-pleasing but erratic players inevitably wind up with fewer trophies than their steadier and less spectacular opponents. So in this sense, it's hardly surprising that the accumulation of Grand Slam singles titles has come to represent the ultimate yardstick for tennis-playing greatness. Yet, if the GOAT debate were able to be straightforwardly resolved in this manner, it would hardly be a subject worth talking about. Djokovic, Nadal and Federer would handsomely lead all comers, followed far behind by the greatest player of the 1990s, Pete Sampras, two champion Australians of the 1960s, Roy Emerson and Rod Laver, the dominant force in the men's game in the mid to late 1970s, Swede Bjorn Borg, and one of the most consistent players of the 1920s, American Bill Tilden. Most of the game's leading players won even fewer slams than this, like Fred Perry and Ken Rosewall 8, John McEnroe 7, and Boris Becker 6. Other legendary champions won fewer still, like Lou Hode 4, Arthur Ashe 3, and Pancho Gonzalez 2. As you can probably already tell, cataloguing players in this fashion isn't really a very helpful guide to greatness. It ignores a whole host of external factors that shaped the careers of the game's leading players from one generation to the next, and prevented many of them from accumulating as many majors as they otherwise might have done. Quite simply, number of Grand Slam singles titles won is only a meaningful statistic if every player in history enjoyed the same opportunities as Federer, Nadal and Djokovic. Consequently, this video seeks to reframe the parameters of the GOAT debate, to take a step back and to examine the question in the wider context of tennis history. At the end of this process, Federer, Nadal and Djokovic may very well still be considered the game's GOATs, but not because they won more Grand Slam singles titles than anyone else. There are plenty of reasons why number of Grand Slam singles titles won is in fact a very poor measurement of a player's overall greatness. Most obviously, Federer, Nadal and Djokovic have all played in a fully professional era, armed with a degree of financial security, as well as teams of coaches, fitness trainers, physiotherapists, dietitians and sports psychologists, of which their forebears in earlier generations could only have dreamed. Consequently, straightforward generational comparisons will always leave past players looking second-rate. They ignore the reality that every player can only thrive in the circumstances of their own generation, and that every generation builds upon the techniques, training habits and technological advancements of those that went before. Put in its simplest terms, the fact that Andy Murray would surely blast Fred Perry off the court does not make him an inherently greater player. Perry shouldn't have to step into a time machine wielding a graphite racket and vanquish the champions of the 21st century in order to prove his greatness. Another factor that makes the tallying of Grand Slam singles titles so misleading as a marker of GOAT status is that it entirely ignores the existence of the amateur-professional divide that afflicted the sport between the 1920s and the 1960s. Tennis was traditionally treated by its various governing bodies as a deliberately amateur sport, meaning that those who made money from the game were banned from competing at the majors. As tennis's popularity soared, however, the game's leading players revolted against the system and turned professional anyway, cashing in upon their celebrity status, touring the world, playing against each other in series of head-to-head matches for contracts that far exceeded anything they might have earned had they remained in amateur ranks. As a result, almost all the champion players of the 1920s through 60s never got to win as many Grand Slam tournaments as they might have done, since most turned pro in their mid-20s after winning just a handful of major titles. The contrasting careers of American Pancho Gonzalez and his near-contemporary Australian Roy Emerson in the 1950s and 60s neatly illustrate the point. Emerson won a then record 12 Grand Slam singles titles between 1961 and 1967, and for more than 30 years remained the most statistically successful male player in the game's history. He achieved this remarkable feat, however, because he repeatedly rejected offers to turn professional, and consequently was left to rule the amateur ranks in the mid-1960s, whilst most of his major rivals, Rod Laver, Ken Rosewall, Lou Hode, etc., were in exile. Pancho Gonzalez's career, by contrast, stands at the opposite end of the spectrum. Those in professional ranks would tour the world, playing against each other in pro tournaments and elongated series of singles matches, developing lengthy head-to-head rivalries over the course of each season. For an entire decade, Gonzalez proved himself the undisputed king of professional tennis, having turned pro at the age of just 21 with only 2 Grand Slam singles titles to his name. In 1954, Gonzalez defeated the newly professional Australian Frank Sedgman, fresh off winning 5 Grand Slam singles titles of his own, 16-9 in head-to-head matches, and Sedgman's distinguished doubles partner, Ken McGregor, 15-0. When American Tony Trabert turned pro after winning 3 of the year's 4 majors in 1955, Gonzalez beat him 74 matches to 27. And when Ken Rosewall and Lou Hode followed suit, Gonzalez beat Rosewall 50 matches to 26, and Hode 51 matches to 36. The clearest indicator of Gonzalez's status as a legitimate G.O.A.T candidate, however, came in May 1964, when, at the age of 36 and well past his prime, he claimed the US Pro Indoor Championships, defeating Hode, Rosewall, and a prime Rod Laver in consecutive matches. As Gonzalez's career demonstrates, the Grand Slam records of the players of the 1920s through 60s often have only minimal bearing upon their actual tennis prowess. And it isn't just the amateur-professional divide that creates this kind of disconnect. What about the intangible role played by injury or other external factors in shaping a player's overall Grand Slam record? Lou Hode in his prime, for instance, was considered by many to have been better than Rod Laver. Yet by the time the Open era began in 1968, Hode had been entirely waylaid by a series of crippling back injuries and had long since ceased to be a serious contender. In modern times, the same might be said of the desperately unlucky Juan Martín del Potro, whose incredible power game at full fitness was a match for the big three, and was certainly in the same class as Andy Murray and Stan Wawrinka, but due to a constant stream of appalling wrist, back and knee injuries, he was barely able to stay on court for more than a few months at a time. His victory over a peak Federer at the US Open in 2009 and his epic Wimbledon quarter-final against Nadal in 2018 are sad reminders of what might have been. Another reason Grand Slam success, as an isolated statistic, can prove so deeply misleading is that it ignores the fact that players have only been systematically playing all 4 majors since the late 1980s. For much of the 20th century, overseas travel proved prohibitively expensive and far too time-consuming for the average amateur player. Only in the 1950s did the game's top players start participating at all 3 Northern Hemisphere slams on a regular basis, whilst the long trip down under proved more than most players were prepared to contemplate even into the 1970s and 80s. As a consequence, plenty of elite Australian, French, British and American players ended up developing inflated Grand Slam records by repeatedly claiming their home slam against minimal international opposition. This fact has tended to be used by the Federer, Nadal, Djokovic cheer squad simply to reinforce their claim that the feats of modern players are inherently worthier than those of their forebears. The reality, though, proved far less black and white than this. In the women's game, for instance, Margaret Court, often accused of claiming 11 cheap Australian titles to inflate her Grand Slam record, won the 1965 Australian Championships by defeating 3 future Hall of Famers, Frenchwoman Françoise Durr, American Billie Jean King, and Brazilian Maria Bueno, in consecutive matches in the quarters, semis and final, in a summer in which all 3 champions just happened to decide to play the Australian leg of the tour. Indeed, sometimes, even without international opposition, the majors could still live up to their name. Most obviously, the men's draw at the Australian Championships in the 1950s and early 60s remained decidedly world-class, despite its largely domestic field, since Australia at the time produced most of the game's top players. Of course, one cannot deny that the overall talent pool at the majors is infinitely deeper now than it was in generations past. Today's top seeds regularly face stern tests from the very first round, with major upsets far from uncommon. The standard of the sport's unseeded players has also dramatically improved as full-time professionalism has taken hold. Until about 30 years ago, the top seeds rarely lost before the third round, and usually not before the quarter-finals. Yet even today, despite their tougher draws, most top 5 players still expect to make the second week of the slams. The difference between good and great players lies in how effectively they navigate that second week. And if one looks back at the actual draws of the majors, all the way back to the 1920s, most Grand Slam champions had to beat at least 2 or 3 Hall of Fame calibre opponents in a row in order to claim the title. Rod Laver's second calendar Grand Slam in 1969 provides the ultimate case in point. What makes Laver's achievement that year so special is that it was completed against a raft of tennis legends. Those in the pro ranks had only just been welcomed back into the Grand Slam fold, and the seedings for each major were chock full of Grand Slam champions. At the Australian Open, so deep was the seeding pool that Laver faced 12-time major winner Roy Emerson in just the third round, before vanquishing 7-time finalist Fred Stolle in the quarters, doubles legend and 4-time singles finalist Tony Roche in the semis, and Spanish future French Open champion Andres Gimeno in the final. Then, at the French Open, Laver defeated future Wimbledon champion Stan Smith in the fourth round, Gimeno in the quarters, and Ken Rosewall in the final. At Wimbledon, the draw was so hot that Roy Emerson was just the 9th seed, Pancho Gonzalez the 12th, and Stan Smith the 16th. Laver would defeat Smith in the fourth round, another future Wimbledon champion, Arthur Ashe, in the semis, and 1967 Wimbledon champion John Newcombe in the final. Lastly, at the US Open, Laver went on to complete his historic Grand Slam by vanquishing Emerson in the quarters, Ashe in the semis, and Roche in the final. It was his dominance over a legendarily world-class field in 1969 that above all else grants Laver his exalted standing in the game's history and leaves him today as the only other player whose name is still mentioned in the GOAT debate alongside Djokovic, Nadal and Federer. Against this backdrop, one could legitimately claim that the chief factor, much more potent than number of Grand Slam singles titles won, that properly defines tennis playing greatness and elevates a handful of champion players into the GOAT conversation, is sustained periods of dominance in which a single player proved themselves the best of their era, despite being rivalled every step of the way by Hall of Fame calibre opposition. This was true, for instance, of the remarkable Frenchman René Lacoste, who in the mid to late 1920s came out narrowly on top in a high-calibre four-way rivalry with American Bill Tilden and his fellow French musketeers Jean Barotre and Henri Cochet. It proved equally true of Bjorn Borg in the mid to late 1970s, who marginally had the better of his intense rivalry with Jimmy Connors and John McEnroe. And it proved true of Pete Sampras in the 1990s, in his day unequivocally the best player in the world on every surface other than clay, in an era in which the likes of Andre Agassi, Boris Becker, Stefan Edberg, Michael Chang and Pat Rafter comprised his chief rivals. It was also true of the all-too-often forgotten Jack Kramer and Pancho Gonzalez, who dominated the pro ranks respectively in the 1940s and, as we have seen, in the 1950s, against a host of legendary Grand Slam champions. And obviously it was also true of Rod Laver himself, who got the better of Neil Fraser and Roy Emerson in winning his first calendar Grand Slam, dominated the pro ranks in the mid-1960s, and, as we have seen, enjoyed a stellar record at the majors when the Open era first began. Calibre and depth of opposition, then, certainly represent defining factors when assessing the worth of a player's achievements. But surely greatness is as much qualitative as it is quantitative. After all, in every sport, we revere great champions not just because they win, but because they look good doing it. This qualitative dimension to tennis greatness is perhaps best exemplified in the contrasting treatment meted out to 1980s rivals Ivan Lendl and John McEnroe. In an incredibly even and competitive era, Lendl, surrounded on all sides by fellow future Hall of Famers, would prove himself the most consistent player of the decade. He won 8 Grand Slam singles titles from an incredible 19 finals between 1981 and 1991. Was world number 1 for a then record 270 weeks, sitting atop the rankings continuously from September 1985 to September 1988, and in total claimed 94 ATP Tour titles over the course of his career. His remarkable feat of spending 3 straight years as world number 1, at a time when those snapping at his heels included Mats Wilander, Boris Becker and Stefan Edberg, bespeaks his incredible level of consistency. McEnroe, by comparison, won 7 Grand Slam singles titles from 11 finals, rarely played the Australian Open and never won it, and only twice made it beyond the quarter-final stage at the French Open. He achieved the world number 1 ranking on 14 separate occasions between 1980 and 1985, but usually only for a few weeks at a time. The longest period he spent atop the rankings was 58 weeks during his stellar 1984 season. McEnroe thus won 7 slams to Lendl's 8, made 11 finals to Lendl's 19, spent 170 weeks as world number 1 to Lendl's 270, won 2 of the game's 4 majors to Lendl's 3, and in total won 77 career singles titles to Lendl's 94. Yet, for all that, few fans and commentators would rate Lendl ahead of McEnroe in the GOAT debate, despite his blatantly superior singles record and supreme level of consistency. Indeed, it was this very consistency that was often treated as a knock against Lendl, as if there was something mechanically dull and unnatural about his style of play. 1930s champion Fred Perry famously quipped at the time, as the ultimate backhanded compliment, that Lendl's career demonstrated that champion players can be built. Just to underscore how illogical such criticisms were, the fact that Lendl identified his net game as a major weakness and hired Australian doubles legend Tony Roach to teach him to serve and volley in the hope of winning Wimbledon was almost seen at the time as a marker of his lack of greatness and a reminder of how untalented he was. By contrast, McEnroe is lionised in popular memory for his supreme natural talent, his laconically elegant style of play, his beautiful serve volleying, his cunning courtcraft and sublime touch. The way they are remembered illustrates that style is just as important as substance in ranking greatness in sport. Because McEnroe was so beautiful to watch, everyone remembers his storied rivalry with Borg and Connors and their epic Wimbledon and US Open encounters. No one ever mentions how unsuccessful he was at the other 2 majors, nor the fact that he peaked at the age of 25 and, at times lacking motivation, thereafter chronically underachieved. In short, Lendl on paper was the greater player, but no one who saw McEnroe play would reach that conclusion. Another reason John McEnroe is so revered amongst Open-era players is that he was one of the few to dominate doubles as completely as he did singles. His success underscores the extent to which the shifting role of doubles in recent decades has come to complicate the modern GOAT debate. Until the mid-1970s, almost every top singles player was just as prolific on the doubles court. Frank Sedgman, for instance, winner of 5 Grand Slam singles titles in the early 1950s, also won 17 titles in doubles and mixed, including calendar Grand Slams in both. Ken Rosewall won 9 doubles titles, Neil Fraser 11, Roy Emerson 16, and John Newcombe 17. But then, beginning in the mid-1970s, Jimmy Connors and Bjorn Borg largely eschewed playing doubles, just as the game began rapidly professionalising, and ever since, singles and doubles have increasingly come to be treated as almost entirely separate disciplines, with precious few elite singles players in either the men's or women's games excelling at both. This development has had profound consequences in shaping the modern GOAT debate. Though never said out loud, doubles today is implicitly treated as a secondary, inferior discipline, played by a bunch of double specialists who are often rather disparagingly written off as those lacking the ability to succeed at singles. In stark contrast, double specialists of yesteryear were held in as high a regard as their singles counterparts. The four so-called French musketeers who dominated tennis in the late 1920s and early 30s included double specialist Jacques Brugnon, who won 10 Grand Slam doubles titles, partnering at various times with all three of his more famous compatriots. In the 1960s, Australians Owen Davidson and Ken Fletcher became renowned for their prowess at mixed doubles, where they formed winning combinations, respectively, with Billie Jean King and Margaret Court. And even as late as the 1990s, as top singles players turned their backs upon doubles like never before, the game's best doubles teams, foremost amongst them the Woodies, Mark Woodford and Todd Woodbridge, remained major stars. Sadly, this is no longer the case today. The professionalisation of the sport, with its increased workloads and expectations, have left the game's top singles players with no time for doubles, whilst modern rackets have drastically affected on-court tactics, leading to a precipitous decline in the overall standard of net play. The problem with today's patronising attitude towards doubles is not only that its leading exponents no longer get their due — most casual fans would be unable to name the best men's and women's doubles pairs in the world right now — but also that from the perspective of the GOAT debate, doubles prowess is completely discounted. Owen Davidson might be the greatest male mixed doubles player of all time, but as far as the GOAT debate is concerned, he's entirely ignored as a good but far from great player who never won a Grand Slam singles title. The same could be said of Tony Roach, a one-slam wonder in singles who formed one of the greatest doubles partnerships in the game's history with his compatriot John Newcombe. Doubles, quite simply, creates uneasy complications for the GOAT debate. It surely elevates the stocks of players like Sedgman, Newcombe and McEnroe who excelled at both. Logically, their doubles prowess ought rightly to rank them above other great singles players who lacked their versatility. The greatest of all time, after all, does not mean the greatest singles player of all time, even if that has become the silent implication. Without question, the most unfortunate aspect of the GOAT debate is that it remains entirely male-centric and completely overlooks the women's side of the game, as if the greatest female player of all time can only ever aspire to become the women's GOAT, whilst the actual GOAT is presumed to be male. This argument is rooted in a pernicious double standard, common to all international sport, which portrays the best female athletes as champions by women's standards, but not by the standards of their male counterparts. Indeed, when Serena Williams suggested a few years ago that given her Grand Slam record, she should be considered the GOAT and not just the women's GOAT, John McEnroe felt compelled to publicly deride her claim, declaring that she would be unable to beat the world's 700th ranked male player. McEnroe's argument is a common refrain heard amongst a certain type of male sports fan, essentially claiming that since women cannot beat men in direct competition, claims of male superiority on the sports field are consequently not sexist, but rather a bitter reality that women must learn to accept. Yet these claims utterly fail to stand up to closer scrutiny. Men can run faster, jump higher, throw farther, and hit harder than women due to the extreme differentials in physical size and strength between the genders. Even the shortest and slimmest male professionals, the likes of the Rockes brothers in the 2000s or Diego Schwartzman today, possess significantly greater muscle bulk and consequently far superior court speed and heavier weight of shot than even the tallest and strongest of their female counterparts. This is what grants male players their decisive advantage in head-to-head confrontations against women. It has nothing to do with tennis playing ability. No one, for instance, could claim with a straight face that the world's 700th ranked male player is more talented than Ash Barty or Ons Jabeur, even though he would almost certainly be able to utilise his physical assets to hit them off the court. In essence, women don't play men at sport for the same reason that in boxing, male featherweights don't fight male heavyweights. The women's game, from an objective standpoint, in terms of the calibre of tennis produced, is every bit as good as the men's. The only logical conclusion to draw from this is that there should always be a men's GOAT and a women's GOAT, rather than a single GOAT across both genders, for male and female players cannot meaningfully be compared with one another, since male superiority on the tennis court is physical rather than skills-based. Indeed, all the markers of greatness already described for the men's game are equally applicable to the women's. The Pro Tour, for instance, smaller in scale and significantly less lucrative though it was, still lured a variety of champion female players into early Grand Slam retirement. Frenchwoman Suzanne Longlong, tennis's first global superstar in the early to mid-1920s, turned pro in 1926 after winning 6 French championships and 5 Wimbledons. Americans Alice Marble and Pauline Betts followed suit after dominating the immediate pre- and post-war tennis seasons in 1939 and 1946, respectively. And perhaps most memorably, Althea Gibson, tennis's first African-American champion, dominated the 1957 and 1958 seasons before surrendering her amateur status, claiming that even as the Queen of Tennis, she reigned over an empty bank account. Meanwhile, other prohibitive factors, emotional burnout, physical injury, and indeed pregnancy, have arguably shaped the women's GOAT debate to an even greater extent than the men's. American Tracy Austin, Swiss Martina Hingis, and Australian Ash Barty provide the preeminent examples of multi-Grand Slam winning champions who robbed themselves of further Grand Slam glory by retiring far too young, in Barty's case as the undisputed world number 1 and the reigning Wimbledon and Australian Open champion. Pregnancy, for obvious reasons, has proven yet another intangible. A few high-profile players, Margaret Court, Yvonne Goolagong, Kim Clijsters, actually managed to enhance their GOAT credentials by returning to Grand Slam glory after becoming mothers. On the other hand, Serena Williams never recovered the fitness levels and mobility necessary to claim the coveted 24th major she was seeking. And to cite perhaps the most pertinent example, motherhood and family completely derailed the Hall of Fame caliber career of Serena's Belarusian rival Victoria Azarenka, who ran Serena a close second across the 2012 and 2013 seasons, claiming a pair of Australian Open titles and twice finishing runner-up to Serena at the US Open in tightly contested 3-set finals. Since the birth of her son, however, and the bitter custody dispute with the boy's father that followed, Azarenka has remained a top 20 player without ever recapturing the hyper-athletic, no-holds-barred power game that took her briefly to the world number 1 ranking in 2012. Physical injury, however, remains the single most significant factor in shaping the women's GOAT debate, ostensibly because it derailed the careers of 2 legendary champions, Maureen Connolly and Monica Seles, who surely would have accumulated roughly as many Grand Slam titles as Margaret Court, Serena Williams and Steffi Graf, had they not had their careers ruined by events beyond their control. No player in the sport's history, male or female, has been as utterly dominant as Maureen Connolly was in the early 1950s. She won her first Grand Slam singles title at the age of 16, and thereafter, over a 3-year period between 1951 and 1954, proceeded to ground down every opponent she faced with metronomic consistency from the baseline. Importantly, she did it all at a time when the depth of women's tennis was growing apace, underscored by the fact that her nearest rivals, Doris Hart, Louise Brough and Shirley Fry, all Grand Slam winning Hall of Famers in their own right, couldn't get near her. To put the extent of her dominance into perspective, Connolly won 9 straight majors, and in 1953 became the first woman to complete the calendar Grand Slam, doing so, quite remarkably, for the loss of just a single set across all 4 tournaments. Tragically, 2 weeks after her 1954 Wimbledon triumph, she suffered a horrific broken leg in a horse riding accident and was forced into premature retirement at the age of just 20. Monica Seles, meanwhile, the first top singles player to play double-handed on both sides, struck her ground strokes far harder than any female player before her, and at the age of just 17, claimed her maiden Grand Slam singles title at the 1990 French Open. Over the next 3 years, she proceeded to crash and bash her way to a total of 8 majors. Most impressively, she unseated Steffi Graf as the game's best player, beating her in 3 out of the 4 Grand Slam finals they contested and taking the world #1 ranking from her. By the time Seles claimed the 1993 Australian Open, it looked as if she and Graf would be battling it out for the rest of the decade. Tragically, in April of that year, an obsessed Steffi Graf fan stabbed Seles in the shoulder at change of ends during a tournament in Hamburg, leaving her not only with a potentially career-threatening physical injury, but also with life-changing emotional trauma that flung her into anxiety and depression and required extensive therapy to overcome. Her return to the tour, more than 2.5 years later, would prove arguably the greatest comeback in the history of modern sport. Returning in late 1995, she made the US Open final at just her second tournament back, before claiming her 9th Grand Slam singles title at the 1996 Australian Open. Seles would remain a top 10 player for the next half a dozen years, but she never claimed another major. She and Maureen Connolly, alongside Alice Marble, Pauline Betts, Althea Gibson, Ash Barty, and arguably Martina Hingis, may be considered the game's outstanding might-have-beens, champion players whose Grand Slam resumes barely reflected their ability or the extent of their dominance at their peak. These great champions aside, however, number of Grand Slam singles titles won remains a much more meaningful statistic in the women's GOAT debate than it does in the men's. Margaret Court, Serena Williams, Steffi Graf, Martina Navratilova, Chris Evert, and the leading player of the 1930s, Helen Wills Moody, followed at a distance by Billie Jean King, are on paper the clear frontrunners in the GOAT debate, accumulating more Grand Slam singles titles than any of the game's best men prior to the Big Three. The Navratilova-Evert and King-Court rivalries are the stuff of legend. Court and King played each other 32 times between 1963 and 1973, and are best remembered today for their 10 epic Grand Slam singles encounters, with Court coming out ahead 6-4. Navratilova and Evert, meanwhile, enjoyed one of the greatest rivalries in all of international sport, playing each other an extraordinary 80 times between 1973 and 1988. Navratilova narrowly won their overall head-to-head rivalry 43-37, whilst the pair fought out 14 Grand Slam finals and 8 semi-finals, almost always in tight 3-set contests. Steffi Graf, for her part, usurped Navratilova and Evert's position at the apex of the women's game, winning the calendar Grand Slam in 1988 and going on to dominate the WTA Tour for much of the 1990s, whilst Serena Williams, as we shall see, across a career blighted by health and fitness issues, kept climbing back up the mountain to the top of the rankings like no other player in the game's history. What grants these wonderful champions primacy in the GOAT debate is that they ruled the women's game at a time when plenty of other revered Hall of Famers were snapping at their heels. King and Court were not only up against each other, but also Brazilian sensation Maria Bueno, Australians Yvonne Goolagong and Leslie Turner, British players Anne Jones and Virginia Wade, Frenchwoman Françoise Durr, and King's fellow American Nancy Ritchie, each of whom claimed somewhere between 1 and 7 Grand Slam singles titles during their careers, and at various times beat both Court and King at the majors. Navratilova and Evert likewise enjoyed fierce rivalries with King and Goolagong in the 1970s, and subsequently faced the challenge of rising youngsters like Tracy Austin and Hannah Mandlikova, and later the up-and-coming Graf and Gabriela Sabatini. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, Graf herself came to enjoy a lengthy rivalry with Sabatini, but also with the likes of Arantxa Sanchez-Vicario, Jana Novotná, Jennifer Capriati, Mary Pierce, and of course Monica Seles. Serena Williams, meanwhile, enjoys her revered place in the game's history, in part because she easily had the best of her head-to-head rivalries with all the game's other top players. It's worth emphasising, too, that as in the men's game, the achievements of the best women's doubles players required genuine consideration in the GOAT debate. American Doris Hart, for example, in the decade after the Second World War, proved herself perhaps the most versatile player in the game's history, augmenting her 6 Grand Slam singles titles with 14 in doubles and 15 in mixed, at Wimbledon in 1951, becoming the only player ever to win all 3 available disciplines at the same Grand Slam tournament in a single year. But the reality was that Hart was far from alone in her versatility in the amateur era. Helen Wills Moody won 9 Grand Slam doubles titles, Maria Bueno 11, Billie Jean King 16, and Margaret Court 19. Doubles specialists, too, are fully deserving of far greater recognition than they traditionally receive. As far back as the 1920s and 30s, American Elizabeth Ryan won a then record 27 doubles and mixed titles with a whole host of different partners. In the 1950s and 60s, another American, Darlene Hard, proved almost as prolific, claiming 18 doubles and mixed titles with 10 different partners. And as late as the 1990s, Puerto Rican Gigi Fernandez and Belarusian Natasha Zvereva succeeded in establishing themselves as 2 of the biggest stars on the women's tour, whilst accumulating 14 Grand Slam doubles titles together. Against this backdrop, it makes perfect sense that Martina Navratilova, like her contemporary John McEnroe in the men's game, has found her GOAT credentials significantly enhanced by the fact that she succeeded in dominating doubles as completely as she did singles, claiming 31 doubles and 10 mixed titles to accompany her 18 singles crowns. Finally, it should be emphasised that just as mercurial male players like Gonzalez, Hode, Laver and McEnroe are lionised in the GOAT debate for how they played as much as for how often they won, the same is true of the women's game. 5 female players in particular, Maria Bueno, Yvonne Goolagong, Martina Hingis, Justine Henin and Ash Barty, are invariably upheld as among the most naturally gifted players of either sex that the sport has ever produced, lauded in their day by fans and commentators alike for their touch, variety, tactical nous, all-court games, and the overt elegance of their stroke play. So where does all of this leave us with regard to the GOAT debate? To achieve a satisfactory answer, it might be best to nominate the GOAT candidates of the 20th century before appraising where Novak Djokovic, Rafael Nadal, Roger Federer, and indeed Serena Williams fit into the debate. There are plenty of 20th century champions who may be considered legitimate GOAT candidates based upon the criteria we have already outlined. On the men's side, René Lacoste proved himself the best player of the 1920s, developing a Grand Slam record slightly superior to those of his 3 great rivals, Henri Cochet, Jean Barotra and Bill Tilden. Meanwhile, Jack Kramer in the 1940s and Pancho Gonzalez in the 1950s dominated the exiled professional ranks where most of the game's top players resided. In similar vein, Bjorn Borg in the 1970s and Pete Sampras in the 1990s likewise proved themselves the finest players of their respective generations, whilst Lou Hode and John McEnroe deserve special mention for the manner in which they played, especially during their stellar 1956 and 1984 seasons when they truly lived up to their full potential. Each of these candidates, however, are also not without their shortcomings. Lacoste's claims are hampered by the fact that he retired at the age of just 28 and consequently never went on, like his chief rivals did, to face the great players of the next generation. Sampras is held back only by his severe limitations on clay, which cast a shadow over his otherwise exemplary record, whilst Borg never played the Australian Open in his prime and never mastered American green clay and hard courts in the same fashion as he did European clay and grass. Hode and McEnroe, for their part, are essentially the wild cards, champions whose actual playing records don't merit serious GOAT contention, but who are so revered for the style in which they played and the breathtaking calibre of the tennis they produced at their best, that they at least deserve to be in the conversation. The impressive resumes, meanwhile, of players like Englishman Fred Perry and American Don Budge in the 1930s, or Australian Roy Emerson in the 1960s, must be taken with a pinch of salt, since they accrued their array of Grand Slam titles at a time when most of their chief rivals were in exile in the pro ranks. Of these candidates, however, only Gonzalez, with his Pro Tour victories over Sedgman, Trabert, Rosewall and Hode, can provide a possible alternative to the clear winner, Rod Laver, who surely must stand above the rest for his 2 calendar Grand Slams and his dominance across the 1969 season against a raft of future Hall of Famers. A similar pattern emerges when considering GOAT candidacy for the women's game. Maureen Connolly's utter dominance over a trio of Grand Slam champions in the early 1950s significantly elevates her GOAT credentials, though how she might have fared against Althea Gibson in the late 1950s, or indeed against Pauline Betts's pioneering serve and volley game had Betts not turned professional in 1947, remain points of contention. Indeed, both Betts and Gibson deserve special consideration, since they were clearly the best players in the world at the time they turned pro and were exiled from the majors. Monica Seles, meanwhile, like Connolly, suffers from the fact that her period of dominance proved all too brief, and her post-stabbing form never lived up to her earlier standards. Nonetheless, even Serena Williams was never as terrifying when blasting world-class opponents off the court as Seles was in her prime, and the fact that she decisively had the better of her rivalry with Steffi Graf, who is almost always highly ranked in the GOAT debate, makes plain that she deserves to be recognised right alongside the most prolific champions in the sport's history. For her part, Graf, armed with 22 majors and a winning record against every other top rival, has to be at least included in the conversation, as should Billie Jean King and Chris Evert, whose records are exemplary despite, like Graf, coming off second best in their most famous rivalries. As for Margaret Court, she certainly acquired a few of her Australian championships cheaply in the amateur era in the absence of overseas competition, but she nonetheless proved herself the best and most consistent player of the 1960s and early 70s, at a time when her chief rivals included close to a dozen future Hall of Famers. Court not only claimed a record 24 major singles titles and 62 overall, but also became just the second of 3 women to win the calendar Grand Slam in 1970. Perhaps the ultimate attestation of her greatness, however, came in 1973, when she returned from pregnancy in her early 30s to win 3 of the year's 4 majors, at a time when Billie Jean King, Yvonne Goolagong and Chris Evert were her closest rivals. Finally, it's worth considering the credentials of 3 legendary champions from a much earlier era whose reputations simply cannot be ignored. Firstly, we have Suzanne Longlong and Helen Wills Moody, the dominant players of the 1920s and 30s respectively, whose GOAT claims are traditionally downplayed due to their relative lack of opposition. It's worth pointing out, however, that on the one occasion they did play each other, at Nice in 1926, their match, which the more experienced Longlong won 6-3, 8-6, was of such an outstandingly high quality that the press dubbed it the match of the century. Against this backdrop, it may fairly be posited that had Longlong not turned professional and then prematurely declined into ill health, she and Wills Moody might well have cultivated a rivalry every bit as hallowed as those between Court and King and Navratilova and Evert. And lastly, beyond each of these worthy champions, the iconic British player of the late 19th century, the diminutive Lottie Dodd, deserves at the very least an honourable mention. Generally speaking, across both the men's and women's games, we tend to justifiably downplay the achievements of Golden Age champions from before the First World War, who played at a time when draws were small, opposition minimal, and few players travelled abroad to compete. Dodd, however, superseded these limitations, becoming tennis's first major celebrity, claiming 5 Wimbledon titles, and most importantly, becoming the first female player to prove herself the equal of the game's best men in terms of skill and courtcraft. Throughout the late 1880s and early 1890s, Dodd famously triumphed in several exhibition matches against the game's top male players. Most memorably, in 1888, she took on men's Wimbledon champions brothers William and Ernest Renshaw and Scottish national champion Harry Grove in best-of-three-set singles matches, in which they spotted her 2 points per game. To the astonishment of those in attendance, Dodd defeated Grove 1-6, 6-love, 6-4, and thrashed then six-time Wimbledon champion William Renshaw 6-2, 6-4, losing only to his brother Ernest, the reigning Wimbledon champion, by the narrow margin of 7-5 in the final set. Thanks to her precocious playing style, dominance over the women's game, and ability to play high-caliber matches against the game's best men, Dodd played a crucial role in legitimising women's tennis, and even though she would obviously be unable to beat Serena Williams or any other modern professional, she deserves a hallowed place in the GOAT debate in the context of the era in which she played. At the end of the day, though, the choice of best female player of the 20th century, I would argue, must go to Martina Navratilova. In terms of longevity and consistency, she reigns supreme. She entered the upper echelons of the women's game in 1973 and remained there until 1994, winning 18 Grand Slam singles titles and 38 in doubles and mixed, before remarkably returning to international tennis in her late 40s to claim a further 3 mixed doubles crowns. The clearest marker of her GOAT status, however, was her incredible run of form between 1982 and 1987. After acquiring a new coach and fitness trainer, Navratilova, across these 6 seasons, enjoyed a period of sustained dominance in both singles and doubles, unmatched in the history of the sport. In singles, she made 20 of 23 Grand Slam finals, claiming 14 titles, and only twice failing to make at least the semi-finals. In both 1983 and 1984, she won 3 of the year's 4 slams, and unofficially completed the Grand Slam, though not in the calendar year, winning 4 consecutive majors from the 1984 French to the 1985 Australian Open. And she did it all at a time when Chris Evert, Hannah Mandlikova, and a young Steffi Graf and Gabriela Sabatini were rivaling her at every turn. What makes Navratilova's feat especially impressive is that she simultaneously proved herself even more dominant in doubles with her partner Pam Shriver. Across 22 Grand Slam tournaments over these same 6 seasons, she and Shriver won 18 majors and only twice failed to make the final. Along the way, they claimed the calendar Grand Slam in 1984 and won 9 consecutive majors from January 1983 to July 1985. Again, this was achieved against a host of Hall of Fame caliber doubles players. Navratilova's success across both disciplines and her near invincibility amidst the rapid professionalisation of the sport in the mid-1980s gives her the nod in the women's GOAT debate over every other player of the 20th century. So, if Rod Laver and Martina Navratilova come out narrowly ahead as the greatest players of the 20th century, how do we incorporate Djokovic, Nadal, Federer and Serena into the debate? Serena's GOAT candidacy rests upon 4 key factors. Firstly, her longevity at the apex of the women's game. Secondly, her head-to-head dominance over her nearest rivals. Thirdly, her versatility as one of only 3 modern singles champions to simultaneously excel at doubles. And fourthly, and most importantly, her ability to repeatedly return to the tour after lengthy periods away and on each occasion climb back to the apex of the sport. Serena's longevity as an elite player is right up there with Navratilova, Billie Jean King and Chris Evert. To put her staying power into perspective, she reached her first Grand Slam singles final in 1999 and her last in 2019. She began her career playing against the greats of the 1990s, Steffi Graf, Monica Seles and Arantxa Sanchez Vicario, and ended it against the likes of Angelique Kerber, Naomi Osaka and Ash Barty. She also, despite all her injury interruptions, finished the season as world number 1 on 5 separate occasions, and won her last major in 2017 at a time when all the champion players of her own generation had long since retired. Perhaps most impressively, in accumulating her 23 major singles titles, Serena achieved the remarkable feat of forging winning records against every other Hall of Fame caliber champion she faced, from Martina Hingis, Jennifer Capriati, Lindsay Davenport and her sister Venus, to Justine Henin, Kim Clijsters, Amelie Mauresmo and Maria Sharapova, to Victoria Azarenka, Li Na, Petra Kvitova and Angelique Kerber. It is, in short, a statistical fact that Serena was the greatest player of her generation in a fully professional era in which she was surrounded on all sides by other all-time greats. And all the while, Serena and her sister Venus were simultaneously forging a dominance over international doubles that is all too often forgotten when appraising their legacies. What makes their doubles career so fascinating is that they played only intermittently and rarely ever outside of the majors, yet walked away with 14 Grand Slam doubles titles and 3 Olympic gold medals, making them the equal second most successful pair in the discipline's history, despite treating doubles almost as a side gig. The most crucial factor, however, in elevating Serena's GOAT claims was her ability to overcome adversity, illness, physical injury and racial vilification, to return to the tour after lengthy periods away, and to repeatedly dominate the majors. Serena's first great era of dominance began in 2002-3, when she won the French Open, Wimbledon, the US Open, and the following year's Australian Open back-to-back, en route to claiming the world #1 ranking for the first time. In so doing, she became only the 5th woman in history to hold all 4 majors simultaneously, a feat dubbed the Serena Slam by the press. After winning Wimbledon in 2003, however, Serena didn't play another match for the rest of the year as she underwent quadriceps tendon surgery to her knee in early August, heralding a 5-year period in which she was repeatedly cut down by a string of serious injuries and illnesses, including a crippling bout of depression in 2006. There were highlights, most notably her 2007 Australian Open victory when she came into the tournament overweight, lacking match practice and ranked 81st in the world, yet walked away with the title, thrashing the favourite Maria Sharapova in the final for the loss of just 3 games. The injuries, though, continued to mount, and it would only be in the closing months of 2008 that Serena would begin her second great charge back towards the top. Recovering form and fitness, she proceeded to win 5 of 8 Grand Slam tournaments between the 2008 US Open and Wimbledon 2010, in so doing reclaiming the world #1 ranking. However, in keeping with the pattern of her career, physical ailments soon struck again. She missed the remainder of 2010 with a debilitating hematoma and near-fatal pulmonary embolism, and didn't play for almost a year. Consequently, by the time she started her third great comeback, her ranking had dropped all the way down to number 169. Serena, though, would yet again prove the doubters wrong, compiling a 33-1 win-loss record across the back half of 2012, winning 5 titles, including Wimbledon, the US Open, and the London Olympics. All of this paved the way for her last and most sustained period of dominance as she astounded the tennis public by claiming a second Serena Slam in her mid-30s, taking out the 2014 US Open and the 2015 Australian Open, French Open and Wimbledon, leaving her once again holding all 4 majors simultaneously. Then, at the 2017 Australian Open, in a performance the equal of her victory at the same tournament a decade earlier, Serena, now turning 36 and pregnant with her daughter Olympia, won her 23rd and last Grand Slam singles title, beating Steffi Graf's Open-era record and leaving her just 1 shy of Margaret Court's all-time record. This is what allows Serena to stand alongside Martina Navratilova as the women's GOAT. To recover peak physical fitness and rebuild her ranking from scratch, and on each occasion return to dominate her often much younger rivals, is an achievement that will almost certainly never be bested. For any athlete, one comeback to the apex of their sport is extraordinary. Serena did it 4 times. So, if Serena Williams stands alongside Martina Navratilova as the women's GOAT, then who is the men's GOAT? The first thing to get out of the way is that Federer, Nadal and Djokovic have all undeniably surpassed Rod Laver in the battle for GOAT status. They effectively achieved what Laver did in both the amateur and professional ranks between 1962 and 1969, but did it over a far longer period of time, and without ever suffering a late career decline, as Laver did in the early to mid-1970s, when he continued playing and showed occasional glimpses of his former brilliance, but was never again a true Grand Slam threat. Indeed, so completely have Federer, Nadal and Djokovic held the rest of the professional tour at bay that only Andy Murray and Stan Wawrinka have been able to make any meaningful impact at the majors. Indeed, the numbers speak for themselves. From the French Open in 2005 to the US Open in 2020, Federer, Nadal and Djokovic between them won 54 out of 62 Grand Slam tournaments, and only twice did a player outside of the wider Big Five win a major title. How this can happen in a fully professional era beggars belief. The real question, therefore, the one that has obsessed tennis fans and commentators for the past decade, is which of the big three is the men's GOAT. I would argue that Roger Federer comes out on top, with Novak Djokovic second and Rafael Nadal third. Now, before all the Nadal fans start coming for me, I just want to emphasise that not only is Nadal, in my view, clearly the third best men's player of all time, he is unequivocally the sport's greatest ever clay courter and the most dominant player on an individual surface that there has ever been. Even Pete Sampras on grass was only half as successful as Nadal has been on clay, and his record of 14 French Open titles in 18 attempts might be the most impressive statistic in the game's history. The reason I rank him third is that, compared to Federer and Djokovic, he has been comparatively less successful on other surfaces. Away from clay, Nadal has won 2 Australian Opens, 2 Wimbledons and 4 US Opens, an exceptional performance by every standard other than Federer and Djokovic's. Moreover, across these 3 other slams, Nadal has failed to reach the quarter-finals 14 times since 2005, often because he is carrying an injury, whilst Federer, by contrast, has only failed to make the quarter-finals 7 times and Djokovic 8. In essence, Nadal is the greatest clay courter of all time, but only once, during his stellar 2010 season, was he clearly the most dominant player year-round against his 2 main rivals. So, if men's GOAT status comes down to a battle between Federer and Djokovic, why do I give the nod to Federer? Federer certainly has longevity and consistency on his side, having made at least the semi-finals at 24 consecutive Grand Slam tournaments between 2004 and 2010, winning at least one major every year from 2003 to 2010, and perhaps most extraordinarily, making at least one Grand Slam final in all but 2 seasons from 2003 to 2019. Beyond each of these achievements, however, Federer is my GOAT selection, quite simply because no player in the history of the men's game has been as dominant as he was between 2004 and 2007. Across these 4 seasons, Federer won 11 of 16 Grand Slam tournaments, and if not for Nadal's dominance on clay, he would surely have won 14 of 16, including 3 French Opens, since during these years he was clearly the game's second best clay courter and the best player in the world by a mile on every other surface. His win-loss record in each of these 4 years was comparable with John McEnroe's legendary 1984 season, when McEnroe won 82 matches and lost just 3. In 2004, Federer won 74 matches and lost 6. In 2005, he won 81 matches and lost 4. In 2006, he won 92 matches and lost 5, and even in his weakest season, 2007, he won 68 matches and lost just 9. And he did it all against Hall of Fame calibre opposition, none of whom, with the exception of Nadal on clay, could get near him. At the Australian Open in 2004, for example, he defeated Leighton Hewitt, David Nalbandian, Juan Carlos Ferrero, and Marat Safin in consecutive matches to claim the title, losing only 2 sets in the process. He won the US Open that year by defeating Andre Agassi in the quarters, Tim Henman in the semis, and in the final, double bageling Hewitt in a one-sided demolition. At Wimbledon in 2005, he dropped just a single set, defeating Hewitt and Andy Roddick in straight sets in the semis and final. At the 2007 Australian Open, he went one better and claimed the title without dropping a single set all tournament, defeating Roddick and a young Novak Djokovic along the way. And perhaps most impressively, at Wimbledon in 2007, he won the tournament by beating Juan Martín del Potro, Marat Safin, Tommy Haas, Juan Carlos Ferrero, Richard Gasquet, and Nadal in 6 consecutive matches. By the end of 2007, no one had any doubt that Federer was the greatest men's player of all time. And I would argue that when his feats are put in their proper context, Novak Djokovic has done nothing in the years since to disprove this contention. Yes, Djokovic holds a record 24 Grand Slam singles titles to Federer's 20 and Nadal's 22. But this statistic is deeply misleading. 2019 was the last season that the big three were all together, dominating the world stage. In that year, Djokovic and Nadal split the majors 2 apiece, whilst Federer, in his last full year on the tour, lost to Nadal in the French Open semis and to Djokovic in a nail-biting Wimbledon final. Since then, Federer has slid into retirement, and Nadal has become ever more injury-prone, playing only 2 majors in 2020 and 2021, and barely playing at all in 2023. Although Carlos Alcaraz, Daniil Medvedev and Jannik Sinner have all proven themselves genuine champions in their own right and a serious threat to Djokovic, it nonetheless remains true, as it has done for the past 15 years, that the Big Three's general standard of play from match to match is so consistently high that even their fellow top 10 players can't get over the line against them in the big matches. As a consequence, Djokovic, at last freed from his rivalry with Federer and Nadal, has accumulated 8 Grand Slam singles titles in 4 years, largely in their absence, to jump from 3rd to 1st on the list of Grand Slam champions. The reality is that he was in last place when all 3 were on court, and is only in 1st place now because he's the youngest of the trio and consequently the last man standing. Indeed, on the subject of age, the other factor everyone forgets that undeniably tips the scales in Federer's favour is that he was already past his prime when Djokovic first hit his stride. Yes, Djokovic was clearly the game's 3rd best player by 2007, but from then until the end of 2010, he claimed only 1 major singles title and proved as incapable of forcing himself into Grand Slam contention against Federer and Nadal as everyone else in the world's top 10. By the time he elevated his game into their stratosphere in 2011, winning 3 of the year's 4 majors with a Federer-esque 70-6 win-loss record, Federer was already 30 years old and arguably 18 months into his long relative decline as a player. It's far too easy to forget that Federer is the same generation as Lleyton Hewitt, Marat Safin and Andy Roddick. He is 5 years older than Nadal and 6 years older than Djokovic. That means that as Djokovic was reaching his peak in his mid to late 20s, Federer was moving through his early to mid 30s. Only at the Australian Open in 2008 did Djokovic beat a prime Federer in Grand Slam competition, and the rest of the time in the late 2000s, Federer defeated Djokovic decisively the majority of the time. In essence, all of Djokovic's celebrated victories over Federer since 2011 have been achieved against a player in relative decline. Indeed, what does it say about Federer at his peak that in his absolute twilight in 2019, at the age of 38, he was 1 point away from beating Djokovic to win yet another Wimbledon title? Federer, in other words, even on the cusp of middle age and a shadow of the player he was in 2004-7, was still able to take Djokovic to the brink. Finally, there is the qualitative dimension to the Federer-Djokovic-Nadal rivalry. Djokovic's almost total dominance over all the game's other top players, outside of Federer, Nadal, Murray and Wawrinka, derives heavily from the fact that he essentially possesses the perfect modern game style, with extraordinary defensive skills and an unsurpassed ability to turn defence into attack at a moment's notice. There is nothing Djokovic does on court that isn't the safest and best option available. That's why he is so hard to beat. To beat him regularly, you need to be able to match his consistency and tenacity, but to have in your armoury a level of flair, of X factor, that supersedes his. This is why Carlos Alcaraz, at his best, is able to beat Djokovic. It also explains why Stan Wawrinka always found Djokovic the easiest of the big three to beat. His superb defence, combined with his extraordinarily powerful shot-making ability, proved the perfect blend of attack and defence to take Djokovic down. It's also the reason why all the other top 10 players of the past decade have struggled to match Djokovic over 5 sets. Since Federer and Nadal have faded from the scene, Djokovic's enduring dominance has essentially arisen from the fact that everyone else in the world's top 10 nowadays plays the same grinding baseline, heavily topspun style as he does, just not quite as well. Federer, by contrast, is unquestionably the most mercurial player in the sport's history. Think of the way old-timers talk reverentially about Pancho Gonzalez, Lou Hode, Rod Laver or John McEnroe. These accolades are true of Federer's game in spades. His swashbuckling style is unparalleled, and the fact that it is augmented by an elegance of stroke production never before seen makes him all the more special. His highlights package is unsurpassed, and unlike Nadal and Djokovic, who are baseliners that, like Ivan Lendl, have taught themselves to volley well, Federer can play every shot in the book as well or better than anyone in the game's history. In short, Nadal is better than Federer on clay. Djokovic is better than 30-something Federer in the 2010s, but Roger Federer, in his mid to late 2000s incarnation, was far more than anyone, including Djokovic and Nadal away from clay, could consistently handle. This is why, in my opinion, Roger Federer is the GOAT of men's tennis.